Good evening, everyone. Allow me to share my screen with you from all around the world. Welcome. My name is Patrick de Park, and I am the Dean of the Graduate School of Business. I welcome you from all over the world. Nazarbayev University is a research-driven academic institution with real global ambitions. Among its more than 550 faculty members, it counts a Nobel laureate, multi-professors that have published with Nobel laureates, and scientific innovations recognized around the world. Our faculty come from approximately 60 different countries and from the best universities in the world, like Harvard, Stanford, MIT, National University of Singapore, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Purdue University, Duke University, Cambridge University, Columbia University, and many more. Myself, I moved here a little bit under 7 years ago from Northwestern University in Chicago. The university has schools of public policy, education, engineering, and digital sciences, mining and geosciences, science and humanities, medicine, and of course the Graduate School of Business. And you see here all the top strategic partners that we work with. In addition to these partners, we have partnerships with many more universities. At the Graduate School of Business, we have the ambition to develop critical thinkers, innovators, and business and civic leaders of the future. All this to support the vision that as a country, Kazakhstan can innovate, produce, and grow the economy enough to become one of the top 30 economies in the world by 2050. We do this through our educational programs like the MBA program, a standard of all business schools, of course, the Executive MBA program, which is our biggest program with 46 participants currently, our Master of Science in Finance program, a Master in Engineering Management program that we offer together with the School of Engineering, and soon a Master in Human Resource Management and a Master in Logistics and Supply Chain Management. Notice also that I indicate that we have executive education programs. These professional development programs, usually shorter 2 to 3 day programs and custom tailored programs, have trained over 4,000 business professionals over the last 5 years. Our research is broad and far-reaching, but we focus especially on finance and financial markets, entrepreneurship and innovation, and transformation management of emerging economy companies. Just like the university at large, we have global ambitions. Not only do our degree programs have a significant international component built into the programs, our students go to London, to the USA, to Duke University, to Dortmund University to study project management, but we also increasingly attract program participants to our programs here in Astana, in Nur Sultan, from top universities around the world, such as HKUST and the City University of Hong Kong, both in Hong Kong, Skolkovo Business School in Moscow, and coming up, a program that will host 40 to 45 Harvard Business School MBA students right here to study and understand more of the Belt and Road Initiative. Our graduates get top positions in Kazakhstan's leading companies, but are equally pursued by international employers, such as Amazon, PwC International, Google, Microsoft, and Goldman Sachs. One of our graduates even has a startup company on artificial intelligence in Silicon Valley. But let's get back to tonight's seminar, tonight's webinar. With the current pandemic, the world is facing a challenge unequal to anything we have experienced before. I would say in history, it's the first time that the entire world is facing the same challenge. This is not only a health crisis, but very much also an economic and business crisis and a manufacturing crisis. Our current way of doing business is very much based on the presence of efficient global supply chains. Tonight, you may sit down for dinner in your IKEA kitchen, Swedish, with some French cheese, some Georgian wine, while you watch a movie on a computer that was designed in Silicon Valley, with screens manufactured in Korea, Taiwanese processors, and assembled in China. Our supply chains are truly global. We really heavily rely on these global supply chains. Global supply chains allow us to make high quality products readily available at affordable prices. But with most borders closed, those global supply chains are in jeopardy. In today's webinar, Professor David de Remer will discuss with you the future of global supply chains. Professor David de Remer has undergraduate and graduate degrees in applied mathematics and statistics from Harvard University, has a PhD in economics from Columbia University, and spent a year as an exchange scholar at Stanford University, and is now with us at the Graduate School of Business at Nazarbayev University. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor David de Remer. David, the floor, or should I say the screen, is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Patrick. So while I'm setting up my screen share, let me just point out that to ask questions, please use the chat window, and we'll be sure and do our best to address your questions by the end of the presentation. Okay, so yeah, as Patrick mentioned, the subject of today's talk is the future of global supply chains. So one way to think about the global economy is through the various kind of consumer goods that you all have at home, as Patrick mentioned. Now, in the diagram that you see in front of you, what you have is showing you the network and connectedness between all the major economies of the world. You see here US, China, Germany, Japan, all being very prominent. Now, what is this network representing exactly? It's not just representing the actual trade flows between countries, but this is just simply representing the trade in intermediate goods between countries. So not the consumer goods we were just discussing, but all the intermediate stages of production are being illustrated here by the thickness of these lines between countries. Another key thing from this diagram, the countries that have been colored in red here have all initially been heavily affected by the coronavirus. Now, in more recent days, probably the US, the UK, Russia, Brazil have been the countries that have been most affected, but this is the situation we have today. So let me just go back a bit. Okay, so just to remind you, so we will not use the hand raise function to ask questions. If you want questions, you can feel free to type it in the chat. Okay, so to introduce the talk, let me just go over some basic terminology here, and then I'll just discuss a bit more about the present situation. So when I mean global supply chains, I'm largely going to be discussing this fragmentation of production. And this is one thing that really distinguishes the last 40 years or so of global trade from past history. So the fact that production has been fragmented into many different stages. Also in that previous diagram included services trade, business to business trade as well, any kind of intermediate stage of production going across borders. This is the main subject I want to talk about today in terms of global supply chains. As I said, firms could offshore across borders, parts, components, or services. Now, one other bit of terminology before I move on. You may also see the term global value chains in addition to global supply chains. The major difference between these two is more about the subject that they come from. So global value chains is a term that originates more in the international business literature from Michael Porter and has since been fully adopted by international economists and all the international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, WTO, and so on. Global supply chains is more common in looking at operations research and is also more commonly used in public discourse, say in this Financial Times article that I've cited here. Now, looking at the importance of global value chains for development has been a big focus of all of our various international institutions and academic research. Global value chains was the subject of the World Bank's 2020 World Development Report. I will heavily be citing this in today's talk, as well as synthesizing many other sources and giving you my thoughts today. As I use these sources, a standard disclaimer applies. All of these reports come from various different research institutions and do not represent the views of the actual institutions, say the views of the World Bank. Okay, but main point here, the terms global value chain and global supply chain, I'll use fairly interchangeably throughout today's talk. So before I move on, so the next I'll discuss is the various aspects of the current situation that we observe today. So I won't be able to bring you data on the differences between overall trade and more intermediate trade and supply chain trade. So we'll just look at how trade has been disrupted. So there is a bit of a lag in terms of how we can get trade data usually. What I'm showing you here is data from the IMF that is actually able to look at data from ships and public signals coming from ships, which allows us to forecast trade with a really excellent accuracy. This kind of technology and research has only come about within the last couple years or so. But using this technique, we can get real-time data from these ship signals. And what do we see here? So one of the clearest ways to see the impact of coronavirus on the global economy is this steep decline in trade coming from China. Of course, the pandemic originally originated from China. And you see here this huge collapse in Chinese trade, starting from the beginning of February, though it has rebounded substantially and adjusted 6 weeks later, coming into mid-March. So that's one very first sign of how COVID-19 has affected this global environment. Okay, so what's the situation in the current environment here? Clearly, there have been major disruptions to global trade, exposing a lack of supply chain robustness. So sometimes you hear the words resilience and robustness used. Resilience is a bit more common. I'll distinguish a bit between these two terms as we go forward. But by robustness, I mainly mean firms are relying heavily on China, as we saw in the first diagram. So there isn't very much redundancy in supply chains. Why is that? Firms have wanted to have very lean supply chains, just-in-time inventories. We'll discuss other reasons for this later, but for various reasons, economies of scale, the heavy fixed costs and investing in relationships, there is a very limited redundancy in these supply chains. Other features of the current situation. Amplified economic nationalism. You hear a lot of demands for reshoring as a response to the present crisis. Countries claiming that that reshoring will solve the problems that we've observed in the last few months. I'll discuss these claims critically today. And of course, the end result is many are rethinking their level of dependence on China, whether or not countries can really succeed in reducing their dependence on China. We'll discuss more critically going forward. Okay, and then just a few more details in terms of how supply chain trade has been impacted. So you can see here, or just overall, how overall trade has been impacted. We can reduce the kind of seafaring exports based on the type of good being exported. So what do you see from this figure here? You see a huge decline in trade in vehicles. So what's specific about vehicles? These are durable goods, which are purchases that one can postpone. Okay, and yeah, other kinds of export trade you can see have not been as heavily affected. There was, of course, a big decline in oil exports in the first initial months of the crisis. These have picked up again. I don't have here the diagram for imports, but imports of oil have fallen, have been a bit flatter than you see in this diagram because a lot of this oil is just going offshore and not being imported. Now you can see recovery in other kinds of exports from China, though. The biggest decline again coming in durable goods. Okay, so that's a summary of the present situation. Okay, so let me summarize next what I plan to go over in this talk. So questions today, we've already discussed how the pandemic is disrupting global supply chains. Again, to have the very detailed data, it comes with a bit more of a lag, but we can see a lot from the C data. Exactly how much the impact has been. And of course, we've also seen all these impacts in hiring and businesses and macroeconomic activity and so on. The main question that I want to focus on, though, is first of all, what explains the supply chain trade that we observe today, or observed prior to the pandemic? So to understand what's going to happen after the pandemic and what's going to happen in the long run, we need a good understanding of the supply chain trade that we've observed already. And then once we've had that discussion, then we can more informed think of the question, is the era of globalized supply chains over? Are we going to observe a lot more reshoring as a consequence of this? And then lastly, we can discuss to a degree, how will Kazakhstan be impacted? Okay. So can Kazakhstan do a better job of entering into global supply chains? Will its plans be stymied by this coronavirus pandemic? I see that one of the questions already is focused on this related question. So we'll touch on that by the end of today's talk. Okay, so that's the plan for today. Apropos of almost nothing, here's a picture of a rainbow in Nazarbayev University last week. I feel Nazarbayev University is the pot of gold at the end of this rainbow here. Okay, now before we get into some of the theory of why we see more global value chains today, let's just go over some of the recent history and what participation in global value chains looks like. Here's one map of the world that allows us to see the variety of global value chain participation that we observe. So you can see that, so you can see from this diagram that there are three centers largely that are colored blue. One is North America, the other is Europe, the third is Southeast Asia and China. And these are really the major centers of these supply chain networks. Okay. And other colors here, you can see that the reds and the oranges, which include Kazakhstan, are countries that are mainly participating in terms of supplying commodities, raw materials like oil, etc. A few other countries are starting to participate more with limited manufacturing. So some of the biggest growth areas here are some of the countries in the light blue. So maybe a decade ago, we saw a lot greater role of Brazil and Argentina. Some of the more frontiers today are countries like Myanmar and Ethiopia. So Myanmar is now picking up more of the supply chain activity from other countries in Southeast Asia or China, looking for either even lower cost. Ethiopia is picking up more activity that's more labor intensive, while Myanmar is picking up more activity that is more capital and machine intensive in terms of production. Okay, so that's the global pitch, one global picture of what supply chains look like. And here's another way of looking at this. With these diagrams here, we've now represented the trade network, just showing the most important trade flows between countries. So the diagram in the top left here is showing you all trade flows measured by the value added that's incorporated in those trade flows. Okay, so by value added trade flows, I mean that we're actually looking at the value added, say, by the manufacturing or services that were actually produced in the country that is exporting the product. Whereas oftentimes in global value chains, you may import some other intermediate from another country. So in that case, you haven't provided value added of that intermediate good that you've imported. Okay, so what this diagram is showing is just these, just showing you these value-added trade flows. Okay, and so the top left, we just have all value-added trade flows, which also includes the exporting of final goods. And in the bottom right, we have just the trade flow in intermediate goods, so that's excluding more final goods. Regardless of which picture that you look at, you see the similar pattern that Germany, China, and the United States are the three points that are central to this global supply chain network here, with other countries being closely related. In most cases, you see that these connections are happening at a highly regional level. So most of these countries closely connected to Germany are other European countries. Most of these countries connected to China are other Southeast Asian countries. Notice that the flow of final goods from the United States to Kazakhstan is actually important enough to show up on this diagram. Same thing with the exports of the United States to Singapore. So that's one major exception of the major trade flow that isn't quite as geographically, that isn't quite as importantly determined by geographic proximity. And yeah, and with the trade flows and intermediates, you see a similar picture. You'll notice again the relationship with Kazakhstan is different here. You see that that the flow of intermediate goods from Russia is relatively more important for Kazakhstan, whereas the imports of final goods, the trade flows of final goods, this is more of a US to Kazakhstan relationship. Okay, so that's a nice overview of the three centers of global value chain activity. Okay, and then just one other bit of stylized fact to point out here, or one other set of stylized facts to point out here, in which industries are these supply chains important? So on the right-hand axis here, on the lower axis here, you see the extent of global value chain participation in 1995, plotted against the global value chain participation in 2011. The various circles are sized by how important the industries are in overall global exports. So you can see that in manufacturing, the importance of global supply chains has continued to grow. You may not really tell the importances of services here. So services are colored in light blue. But services have gone from being responsible for only about maybe 15% of global value chain trade a couple decades ago to being responsible for nearly half of global value chain trade today. So services offshoring and services participation in global value chains has become far more important than it was a couple of decades ago. Surely the growth in information and communication technologies has been one significant reason for this trend. And I can imagine that this will continue even further now that firms are becoming a lot more accustomed to remote work as a result of the present crisis. Okay, so that's a picture by industry of the importance of global value chains. Okay, now I've shown you some pictures of the last couple of years before the pandemic. Now let's look at what the longer term trend was here. So what we see is that global value chain trade increased heavily between 1970 and 2008 or so. Then there was a bit of a sharp slowdown right around the global financial crisis in 2008. So this trend did flatten substantially in the last decade. Now, what do we mean by the share of the global value chain share of trade? So we're including here both any kind of trade that either involves importing intermediates with a substantial value added, or exporting downstream to somebody else who then provides additional value added before they export that final good to consumers. So by this measure, about half of trade is global value chain trade today, but this number had started to decline in recent years, even before the pandemic. Okay, so what are some reasons for these trends that we observed? We'll get into that in the next couple slides. Okay, so what were the basic reasons for this global value chain integration? The main point I want to raise here is that access to high quality inputs has been really crucial for productivity of any firm in manufacturing or other industries. Okay, so the most important way that you grow from trade is not simply about gaining access to larger markets, but being able to access these high quality inputs. This is a fact that has been heavily underemphasized either by international economics research up until maybe a couple decades ago. Even international economics instruction still doesn't emphasize this point nearly heavily enough. So one reason for this, the first study that really looked at this carefully was looking at firm level data from Indonesian firms in the last decade of the 20th century. One reason I'm highlighting this study, it's by Mary Amidi and Joop Konings. Appropriate to mention for the 10th anniversary of Nazarbayev University, Joop Konings is a Nazarbayev University professor, he first joining the economics faculty in 2016. Now he'll be rejoining the NUGSB faculty this fall. So what did the study show? It showed that that the productivity gains for Indonesian firms after they reduced trade barriers, most of these gains came from the fact that Indonesian firms had access to very good inputs once they reduced these trade barriers. The gains from these higher quality inputs were twice as large from any other kinds of gains in productivity from reducing these trade barriers. So oftentimes economists emphasize that lower trade barriers means tougher competition. That means that firms need to get tougher because of facing tougher competition from reduced trade barriers. But really the main channel in which firms become more productive from trade liberalization is this ability to import high quality inputs. Okay, and this kind of result, it's been replicated across many different countries. The Indonesian trade liberalization in the early 90s, in India is one major example. The Hungarian accession to the European Union, circa 2004, that was another major example of this. So Hungarians were able to import high quality German machines, which drastically improved the quality of manufacturing in Hungary once Hungary joined the EU. Okay, so that is really the key point here in terms of global value chain integration and how it leads to more productive firms. And this result, as the last diagram here shows you, has also been shown to hold roughly true worldwide. And you can see here a relationship in this last figure between global value chain participation and labor productivity. Now, to be careful, this one diagram doesn't necessarily show a causal relationship, but this relationship between imported intermediate goods and productivity has been carefully shown in individual countries like Indonesia, India, and Hungary. Okay, and one last bit that I want to discuss that I think is of particular political importance when thinking about global value chains is the distributional consequences of these global value chains. Of course, some firms may compete directly with foreign input suppliers, and oftentimes when anyone thinks about reducing either trade barriers or reducing barriers to immigration, oftentimes everyone is thinking mainly about the direct competition. So in that case, in economic terms, you're thinking about foreign suppliers being substitutes for your domestic suppliers. Okay, but understand that it's not necessarily true that these inputs, their main effect is going to be a substitution effect. Oftentimes the case is going to be that these high quality foreign inputs are actually going to complement local suppliers. I mean, they may not complement the local suppliers that are the direct competition, but many other local industries in your country are going to benefit from the fact that you have these higher quality foreign inputs that are going to increase your productivity. And this is a fact that has been shown to be true in many different countries. So I've shown you just one diagram here showing some evidence for this from Bangladesh. So the blue line is showing foreign direct investment into Bangladesh. So this is the reliance of foreigners or the impact of foreigners, the direct impact of foreigners on Bangladesh, illustrated by the blue line. The green line here is showing you the number of local intermediate input suppliers here, and showing this positive relationship. Again, this one plot is not going to be necessarily evidence of the causal relationship, but careful economic research has been done both for Bangladesh and the United States, showing that this kind of relationship holds true. So in the United States, it has been shown that firms that did import important intermediates from other countries, that these firms in the United States did rely more heavily on local sourcing as well. This is again showing this kind of complementary relationship between the foreign inputs and other domestic firms. This kind of result also is very important for immigration as well. So some of the big news in the United States within the past week was US President Donald Trump severely limiting certain kinds of visas to foreign citizens, such as the H-1B visa, which is very important for US firms providing jobs to foreign immigrants. This kind of policy decision is very much focused on the idea of immigrants being substitutes, but if you read any testimonials from recent immigrants to the United States in the last decade, you can understand the huge impact that all immigrants to the United States have had in terms of creating jobs in the United States and improving productivity in the United States across generations. So, I mean, I think one main point I want to get out of this talk is this idea that foreign inputs or foreign immigration can be hugely complementary to locals as opposed to simply providing competition. Okay, and oftentimes it's just this effect of competition that is dominating the political debates. Oops. Okay. Now, what were some of these effects, reasons for this decline in supply chain trade that we had observed? So I think one initial fact is just the financial crisis and the tepid recovery from that. So the financial crisis did create some limitations for trade finance. There was a bit of a slowdown in financial globalization following this financial crisis in 2008. So the early 2000s was a time where capital requirements and regulation, financial regulation in the United States was very weak. This led to a huge boom in investment. Now financial regulation around the world is much tighter. So that's certainly been one reason for this slowdown. A second more recent phenomena, of course, is the US-China trade war. And this has also created a substantial amount of trade policy uncertainty and some reluctance for firms to offshore, knowing that firms knowing that the US and China are in a trade war and that the US has just been generally unpredictable in terms of where it may raise tariffs in the future. This has surely been one reason for at least a slowdown in global value chain participation. Some of this may be just a matter of substitution, though, so there may be less reliance on China, but firms may be more willing to move somewhere else besides China. So we have seen this kind of substitution here as well. A third point to make is about automation. Think about 3D printing. So if you have good capital-intensive production technology that could substitute for both domestic and foreign labor. A caveat to this, though, is that automation can also complement either domestic or foreign labor as well. So some of the initial studies that have actually looked carefully at the impact of 3D printing have actually found that 3D printing has not reduced trade flows, that overall 3D printing in certain industries has been a complement rather than a substitute to foreign trade. So that case may not necessarily be as clear cut. That automation will necessarily lead to a decline in trade, though the relationship is certainly theoretically ambiguous. Two other points to make that are often raised here about why supply chain has slowed, but I think these are both stories about substitution. One is growing wages in China. But again, growing wages in China could lead firms to still continue to offshore, except they might choose to offshore elsewhere in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, or to Mexico, or Myanmar, or Ethiopia. So growing wages in China could explain some of the decline, but this is more of a story about the decline in China rather than a decline to other countries. Okay. Another point is a reaction to natural disasters, like the Japan earthquake in 2011. Now, certainly many firms did cease to trade with, cease to participate in global value chains with Japan as a result of this earthquake. But it may be overstated how much these natural disasters were important in terms of this decline that we saw earlier. Okay, now let's turn to so that's a summary of what's happened in the 50 years or so prior to the pandemic. Now, what's the impact now from the pandemic? Some of this we've already discussed: more demand for supply chain resilience or robustness as opposed to efficiency, political demands for reshoring. So in the bottom left corner here, I have an image of a New York Times editorial describing the Trump administration's policies to demand more reshoring and less offshoring. In other words, less global value chain participation because of the pandemic. Now, these are all policies that the administration had been in favor of already. Now they've seized this as an opportunity to encourage more reshoring. But this idea is also, the idea that there will be more reshoring or more rethinking of supply chains is also even held by many top economists. So in the bottom right corner here, here's a headline from the Financial Times from April by Beata Javorchik, who's a Czech economist, who's the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, raising some of the points we discussed earlier, that that perhaps countries and firms will want to look more towards supply chain resilience or redundancy as a result of the experience with this pandemic. Okay, so that's the view that's out there. Now I'm going to push back on this view a bit in the final minutes of the presentation here. Okay, so what are some reasons for optimism in terms of these trends in global value chains continuing? Okay, so one would be just to look at this experience with Japan. So what happened as a consequence of the earthquake in Japan in 2011? Of course, this was heavily disruptive to the auto industry, which was relying on these auto parts from Japan. Naturally, some firms did substitute away from Japan, but there was no general trend towards actually reshoring, moving back to source countries, or redundancy. So when countries substituted away from Japan, they just moved to another country. They didn't create redundancy by importing from Japan and importing from somewhere else. Okay, so the basic stylized fact here is that as a result of this earthquake and disaster in Japan, firms weren't willing to create redundancy in their supply chains. The kind of facts that we discussed, having lean supply chains, being very efficient, these still were the dominant concerns that still led countries to continue to source from one location. They may have just rethought whether that location should be Japan as a result of this earthquake. And what are some further reasons for this? I'll get to that in the next slide. So a key point here, and this is an important slide here in terms of thinking about the theory of supply chains, is that supply chain relationships require a lot of investment And you can think of these relationships as being very sticky. We observed this kind of stickiness after the financial crisis in 2008, when trade collapsed, that there was a huge decline in trade, but everything went more or less back to the way it was before a couple years later in terms of these trade relationships. What are some reasons for this? It's that modern supply chains do rely heavily on customization and relationship-specific investment. Okay, so different from, say, how supply chains may have functioned many decades ago, this kind of fragmentation, production fragmentation that we observe today is very much relying on the relationships and investment into the relationships. Naturally, there's substantial fixed cost in these relationships, and firms are going to build these relationships considering the possibility, the resiliency in these individual relationships. So firms will invest heavily in trying to prevent any kind of disruptions. They'll choose sources. They'll make sourcing decisions based on limiting the possibilities of disruption. Okay, so this is one reason why it's very difficult for firms to create this kind of redundancy that many are expecting will happen as a result of COVID-19. So many commentators who've said this may be underestimating the extent of fixed costs and involved in these kind of relationships. Understand that these supply chains are not just about importing homogeneous goods, identical goods from abroad. In that case, redundancy would be easy, but clearly this is not the case that we have observed with supply chains over the last few decades. Just 1 hour before the talk, I got an email with an alert from Bloomberg describing a ING Bank study looking at this exact question. They came to the same conclusion that I have right here, that it is going to be very difficult for firms to either decouple from China or make widespread redundancy in their supply chain relationships. And this type of customization that's involved in these supply chain relationships is the major reason why this redundancy is going to be very difficult. And then similarly, reshoring is unlikely to happen either longer term, because again, every economic force that led to the initial relationships will still be prevalent going forward. It's not going to be a matter, first of all, having reshoring is not going to eliminate these problems about robustness. And so these are some reasons to doubt that reshoring is going to be prominent in the future. With one caveat that there could be a lot of government policy or trade protection promoting that. Okay, so we're starting to run thin on time, but let me just make a couple other comments. Here's just one diagram describing what I said before, the possibility that automation will tend to complement imports rather than substitute for them. So this is a figure just showing various industries based on how automated they are, and then also showing how much they import parts from other countries. And you can see here at the industry level, there is a broad trend relating automation industries to the extent that these industries participate in global value chains. Okay, so in the final moments, let's discuss more about Kazakhstan. Okay, so where does Kazakhstan fit into this? A few of you have asked questions about global value chains already. So it's been difficult for Kazakhstan to participate in global value chains throughout its recent history because of the remoteness of Kazakhstan being a landlocked country and not being well connected to either of these centers of global value chain activity that we've been discussing. But this may change going forward thanks to investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. so the Belt and Road Initiative investment is going to be important in linking Kazakhstan to the trade between China and the European Union. So that's the belt part of the Belt and Road, with the maritime part being the road part of it, Maritime Silk Road. And you can see that with these, in the diagram with these Belt and Road Initiative investments, this will be crucial towards connecting Kazakhstan to this EU-China trade. Okay, now some of the other, so there have been some concerns about whether the pandemic will lead many of these Belt and Road Initiative investments to go bust, but there's an article in The Economist about this within the last couple weeks. So some countries that have taken Belt and Road money from China may be in some trouble. China needs to be careful in terms of forgiving and some of these debts. But in the case of Kazakhstan, Kazakhstan relied very little on Chinese financing here. And as I've discussed, for the reasons before, we still expect a lot of globalization to continue in the medium run or the longer run here once the pandemic subsides. So a judge of the Belt and Road Initiative remains a substantial opportunity for Kazakhstan to continue to participate in global value chains. And this also represents the best opportunity for Kazakhstan to further diversify its economy. Okay, so the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative investment, by reducing the remoteness of Kazakhstan, will better increase the potential for Kazakhstan to further diversify and enter into these global supply chains. But just to wrap up, still the main reason for pessimism, though, is the absence of global cooperation, is a decline in global cooperation. So I highlighted this a bit in terms of the US starting to demand more reshoring and the Trump administration throwing up immigration barriers. So that is the major threat that we have in terms of how global supply chains will continue in the future. Fortunately, most of the rest of the world is not following the US lead here in terms of trying to decouple from the rest of the world. So hopefully in the case of Kazakhstan, the relationship between the European Union and China can continue to be fruitful. But the absence of US leadership here is a huge problem for global cooperation and for how much the world can benefit from global supply chains. So it'll be important to see how this develops with the US election come November. What I've illustrated with this diagram is some of the lack of cooperation in terms of export barriers here. So so all these three centers of global supply chains, the US, the EU, and China, all put up substantial barriers to exporting medical supplies and medicines as a result of the pandemic. So this made it very difficult for the other countries outside of these three centers, say Latin America importing from the United States, Africa heavily importing from Europe, and Central Asia heavily importing from China. So this is one illustration of the kind of lack of the consequences of this lack of leadership. Okay, so just some concluding thoughts here. So as I discussed, COVID-19 has provided significant supply disruption, but supply chains do continue to be crucial for economic growth. I'm not a pessimist, as others are, in terms of how supply chains might change as a result of the pandemic. The extent of long-term disruption, or the extent of so there won't be as much either reshoring or redundancy in supply chains as others might expect, for the reasons I described, this kind of stickiness that we have in trade relationships, the fixed cost of these trade relationships that exist in global value chains. But again, the biggest obstacle here is the erosion of global cooperation that we've started to see here in recent months. Absent U.S. leadership, this erosion of global cooperation is a major concern. Okay, if you want to read more about the subject, I highly recommend these reports from the World Bank here, which I've heavily been citing in this presentation. There's a World Bank report on the Belt and Road Initiative from 2019, and then in this recent year, a very detailed report on the role of global value chains for development. Both the World Bank and the WTO had reports on the subject within this last year. Okay, well, thank you for your attention. So let me spend some time in the questions that you've asked. So yeah, so I've touched on this issue of global value chain participation for Kazakhstan already. Again, my main thinking there is that it's been very difficult for Kazakhstan to participate in global value chains because of its remoteness. And also diversification is very difficult for Kazakhstan because of its heavy reliance on the oil industry. So let me also show you one picture here. Yeah, so here's a picture that I've often used in teaching my courses at NUGSB on Kazakhstan's product space. Now, it's only a coincidence that the shape of this product space actually looks kind of like Kazakhstan. But what this is illustrating here is the connection between various products, how certain products are connected to each other, and how easy it is to produce one product rather than another because of previous production. And you can see here that because of the intensity of Kazakhstan's current production, say in natural resources and oil and minerals, there aren't as many easy opportunities to diversify production. But the opportunity to better participate in global value chains in this China to EU trade, connecting these two large hubs of the global supply chain network, this is definitely a major benefit and a major opportunity for Kazakhstan in terms of diversifying its production. Okay, and yeah, so the next is a question from Nurlan from the Center of Trade Policy Development under the Ministry of Trade. Yeah, is largely focused on physical infrastructure. Yeah, so so there's been heavy investment in the physical infrastructure because of these Belt and Road investments. The main policy conclusions coming from everyone who studied this independently, whether it's the World Bank or academics, is to look at a lot of complementary reforms to this physical infrastructure investment. And surely these additional investments, say in logistics or trade facilitation, are going to be important in terms of getting the most out of the Belt and Road Initiative. Same thing for reducing any kind of trade barriers between these countries along this trade route. Naturally, this is going to require some additional international cooperation. It may be the case that countries on either side of these borders are going to undersupply investment in trade facilitation and logistics. So it's going to be important for additional cooperation between countries to get the most out of these investments. Okay, and some other questions. So I see there's some questions about the Eurasian Economic Union. It does seem clear that one reason why Kazakhstan is heavily importing from Russia in terms of inputs is because of the Eurasian Economic Union. So surely the Eurasian Economic Union reducing some external barriers, say with China or the EU, to help also increase access to good inputs for Kazakhstan would also be something that's crucial for Kazakhstan getting the most out of the Belt and Road Initiative and further diversifying its economy. Okay, so we're a bit over time, but let me spend 5 minutes going through some of the remaining questions here.
I'm sorry, David. Bahit already can read out loud all the questions. She has prepared
okay.
already. Yeah, Bahit, you can join us.
So please, Bahit, go ahead with the questions. Yep.
Yes, so the question is, what do you think about integrating to CSM blockchain technology?
Right, so yeah, so what I can say about blockchain technology is that yeah, it reduces some necessity for intermediaries in these supply chain networks and can overall improve efficiency. So by reducing some of these roles of intermediaries, like banks or banks themselves providing some of this technology, this can be something that can help improve these trade relationships. So HSBC, which is the #1 supplier of trade finance, is investing heavily in these kind of blockchain technologies. And one thing I haven't touched on yet in these trade relationships is that the timing of delivery of these products is going to matter a lot, and this trade finance can be a substantial barrier as well. So blockchain does have a lot of potential in terms of improving this efficiency and of trade finance and reducing this role of intermediaries that's necessary for things like letters of credit, for various reasons, either just requiring payment in advance or having open accounts have been the major, which don't involve banks, have been the major forms of trade relationships. And blockchain can certainly improve the quality of this of these letter of credit type and be a substitute for these letter of credit type instruments that have been somewhere in between these two extremes. Okay, next question.
Yes, I think you have seen question about Eurasian Economic Union and perspectives to participate in global value chains. Mm-hmm. And if we are supposed to facilitate free trade agreements to support global value chains, with which countries Eurasian Economic Union should prefer to conclude such agreements?
Yeah, so there has been some, as I understand, there has been some baseline agreement with China, but it's still relatively empty. It's more of a blank slate that can be added to. So yeah, China is clearly naturally the most important trading partner here, both in terms of its proximity and in terms of the level of investment here. There have been some other agreements negotiated with, say, some other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, but yeah, as I mentioned, the European Union and China are going to be the key countries here, naturally based on proximity and their centrality to these global supply chain networks. And one fact to understand about the Eurasian Economic Union is that China actually raised its tariffs to Russian levels when it joined in 2010. So this is something that did somewhat isolate Kazakhstan a bit more within the global economy by joining the Eurasian Economic Union. So surely so there are some advantages for sure to the Eurasian Economic Union in terms of reducing certain internal barriers, say between Kazakhstan and Russia, increased flows of agricultural goods and remittances among Eurasian Economic Union members. But as we move forward, it will be important for the Eurasian Economic Union to achieve better cooperation with China and the European Union based on its importance for the global economy.
Thank you. So I don't know, I don't think you have covered it. There are some theories regarding specialization or diversification of industries. So how global value chains can be used for developing countries like Kazakhstan or Central Asian countries to diversify, because global value chains needs upper level of specialization.
Right, so that's an interesting question. So the question is, do you necessarily need high levels of experience or specialization to be able to participate in these global value chains? So I think the main, so as the diagram that I'm showing right now illustrates, Kazakhstan does have some lack of experience in other industries that create some barriers in terms of it moving into other industries. But at the same time, its centrality between Europe and China does also provide an opportunity and some scope, at least better scope than it has had before in terms of being able to diversify its economy. And in terms of at what level do you need to participate in global supply chains? So there can be various forms of comparative advantage here that countries can take advantage of. Kazakhstan's been investing heavily in terms of education and skills, and this is surely going to, say, with investment in Nazarbayev University, Bolshoi program, and so on. This surely creates opportunities for Kazakhstan to better participate in global value chains in the future. And as I mentioned, countries like Ethiopia and Myanmar have been able to use industrial policy well to help participate further in these global value chains. So it's not like it's going to be impossible for Kazakhstan to make this kind of jump. So I'm an optimist on that. Okay.
Yes, there is a question which is kind of related about the methodology or action plan based on research for Kazakhstan to enter global value chains. So what I've heard from your talk is that it's maybe industrial policy which should incorporate global value chains into consideration when you develop that. Is it?
Okay. So the question is, is industrial policy going to be absolutely necessary for this kind of participation? So let's think of this in a few ways. Of course, there does need to be a role for the state in terms of providing certain public investments, such as the infrastructure. So this is a kind of more horizontal industrial policy that can benefit all industries. Same thing with education. So there is a huge role for the state to play there. Now then, a question of whether there should be a role of industrial policy in terms of targeting, say, various specific industries. So there we need to be a bit more careful. There can be some role for more industry specific investment, but this needs to be very well designed so that there isn't too much industry capture. Kazakhstan does have a heavy history of state-owned enterprises playing a larger role, and to some degree, we want to reduce the role of the state in the economy. But designing good industrial policy that prevents industry capture is an area of a key area of research, and certainly there is some role for it, and Kazakhstan should follow the best practices there, that based on the experiences of other countries. But today I don't have time to get into any further details there and what they may be. But it is something I have taught a lot in my NUGSB courses.
Thank you, David. So there are two questions about China. The one is about how to develop agriculture sector in Kazakhstan to be able to export to China, maybe to increase export to China. It's in Russian. And then another one is about what's the main driver for the US to continue Cold War with China in terms of supply chain new structure other than politics.
Okay, sorry, the second question was...
What is the main driver for US to continue?
Okay, so why is, okay, so let me take the second question first. Yeah, so why is it that the US is doing this? So there are strong political economy forces here. The US initially had a positive impact of its trade relationship with China in terms of getting cheaper consumer goods, and this was very popular. I think the full extent of some of the negative political consequences of trade with China weren't fully recognized until several years into the trade relationship. Now, there is some reason why the U.S. There is some scope for the U.S. to achieve better cooperation with China. So many expected that China, as it joined the WTO back in 2001, would decrease the role of the state in the economy, would play more by the rules. That hasn't really happened. There hasn't been much cooperation in terms of China reducing the extent to which it provides subsidies or its respect for intellectual property for the United States. So there was scope for the US to have more trade disputes with China, but the US wasn't pursuing these nearly actively as it should have been with the World Trade Organization over the last 2 decades. And then when the Trump administration came in, instead of choosing to do this through the WTO, where we have frameworks for dealing with these kind of problems, Trump chose to start the trade war and raise tariffs on steel and raise tariffs for so-called national security reasons. So he chose not to use the methods and the means that we have to resolve these trade disputes nicely, and believing that the US could use its greater bargaining power, being the larger country here, and then not fully understanding the nature of trade deficits between countries. So there's politics there, but largely it's about Donald Trump and his beliefs about how the global economy works. And he mainly looks at the US-China bilateral trade deficit and sees that as a loss to for the United States. And that is not the true relationship between the US and China in terms of trade. This is just, this trade deficit is simply about who exports what to whom right now. It's not like the US is getting ripped off because it's able to provide dollars and assets in exchange for goods instead of present goods. So it's largely about Donald Trump's misconception of things. But there is further room for sure for the US to better cooperate with China going forward. Now, for the question about agriculture and how Kazakhstan could better export to China. So hopefully, as these Belt and Road Initiative investments continue to develop, Kazakhstan is better positioned to attract foreign investment in agriculture. We've seen in recent years Tyson company, U.S. company Tyson, investing heavily in Kazakhstan. Also, some of the U.S.-China trade conflict could also be an opportunity as well for So the fact that trade barriers increase between U.S. and China could also be an opportunity for greater investment in Kazakhstan in terms of accessing the Chinese market. And then for the various reasons I described earlier, we should be optimistic about Kazakhstan's ability to further develop its agriculture sector into higher value-added activities.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So there is one more question.
Okay.
I think, like, what industries in Kazakhstan might benefit from the current disruption?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so agriculture, I think we've already seen this to some degree, like with this Tyson investment I already mentioned. Yeah, so certain US firms trying to access the Chinese market, these multinationals could further invest in Kazakhstan, but that disruption is more about the US-China trade war. In terms of the present COVID disruption, I think one of the major messages here is, like, in terms of some of the border controls, I don't see this having necessarily a medium run or longer run impact. What we have seen surely are what will be more of a longer term impact from this is more remote work, perhaps an increase in more of this services offshoring. And with the level of investment in education in Kazakhstan, I think yeah, there is surely more opportunity to engage in more higher skilled remote activities as a result of everyone's reaction to this pandemic. So those are the first thoughts that come to mind in terms of the impact of the pandemic. Okay.
Yes, I think we ran out of time because it's already.
Yeah, so we're already 20 minutes in. Yeah, so thank you the 40 or so of you who did stay to the end here. Appreciate your attention, but I feel we've had more than a solid 20 minutes to answer questions, so I think we're in good shape. Okay, well, thank you very much. Really appreciated this discussion, and hopefully you all learned a lot from it. Okay. Have a great evening, everybody.
Yeah, on behalf of the school, I have to also remind that this type of webinars we have actually on a permanent basis, which usually we call it business talk and coffee webinars. So please join it on a regular basis. Thank you for finding your time this evening to join our webinar. Special thanks to David.
Okay. Thank you very much.